The Assistant Democratic Leader.
Mr. President, first, is our quorum call?
Yes.
I ask unanimous consent to be suspended.
Without objection.
And I'm learning the etiquette of the mask, which we are trying to make certain we set a good example for a country that is very attentive to the public health care crisis that we face. Mr. President, I listened carefully to the remarks of the Republican Majority Leader, and he spoke about the reconvening of the Senate this day, and he talked about the work that we achieved a few weeks ago, passing the CARES Act, $2.2 trillion in rescue funds for America by 96 to nothing, and then by a voice vote, we passed $484 billion more, almost $2.7 trillion. $2.7 trillion. That is an amount far in excess of the annual federal budget of the United States of America for domestic discretionary spending, and we did it in a matter of days and weeks. We knew that we were facing, as the President characterized it, a national emergency, and we still do. The Senate is here today because the Majority Leader has brought us back to Washington against medical advice. We know what the standard is in the District of Columbia for the people who live here. Stay home, don't meet in groups, work away from your normal working place to protect yourself, your family, and everyone else. But we're back in town. Majority Leader tells us we don't take days off. He says we're here to do the nation's business, which can only be done, only possible when we are here. He talks about taking careful steps back. I've been waiting for the Majority Leader rather, to announce what the business of this week will be. Boy, there are a lot of things we should be doing. I know back home from the endless telephone conference calls that I'm involved in, and the comments by my friends and neighbors in Illinois, that there are many unanswered questions which they would like this Congress to address. And we have been waiting carefully, expectantly, for the Majority Leader to announce what we're doing this week that merits this return. Not just because members of the Senate are being asked to come back. Listen, that's what we ran to do. We promised the people of our states that we would be there to do the business of the Senate and the nation when called upon. And certainly I want to keep that promise. All of us do. But it is appropriate to ask exactly what is it this week that we will be doing. Well, there's a non-controversial nomination that'll be before us in a matter of 2 hours, which is likely to pass by an overwhelming vote. That can't be the reason. There must be more. But what is it? There are lots of things which the Majority Leader could bring us back to do, but it appears one of the things he's most intent on is to make certain that we consider the nomination of a young district court judge from the Commonwealth of Kentucky. This individual was nominated to serve on the district court in the Commonwealth of Kentucky last year. His name is Justin Walker. Justin Walker has a distinction. He is one of 9 presidential nominees sent to the Senate Judiciary Committee by the White House who were judged unqualified by the American Bar Association. It was the American Bar Association that said his absence of any significant trial experience disqualified him to serve at the lowest federal court. Lifetime appointment, make no mistake, but the lowest federal district court. But it seems Justin Walker is well connected with the Majority Leader by having served on his staff, at least as an intern, maybe more, I'm not sure, and other connections that I'm not aware of. But enough that his nomination has become a priority for the United States Senate. And it's interesting. Despite a, quote, career, close quote, on the federal district court of less than 6 or 8 months, despite the fact that he had no trial experience to take that job, the Majority Leader, Senator McConnell, wants this man to be elevated to the second highest court in the land, the D.C. Court of Appeals. I don't understand it. It's certainly hard to argue that this is part of a response to a national health emergency in America. It has nothing to do with it. It is a political decision, clearly, to elevate this man, of all the members of the federal district court bench across the nation, to be next in line to be considered for the Supreme Court. I hope he's seen a federal trial in the time that he served on the district court in Kentucky. I guess we'll find out on the hearing that's been called for Wednesday of this week. So when the majority leader comes to us and says we have important nominations that deal with national security, I'm sorry, but Judge Walker's not one of them. What we have in his confirmation hearing is a political decision for a political advancement at the risk of this Senate and the hundreds of people who are working here today because we've been called back. What else could the Senate Judiciary Committee do other than to entertain Senator McConnell's former intern to be raised to the second highest court in the land? Well, there are a number of things we might consider. I think of the contact tracing. That contact tracing is going to be our key to reopening the economy in America. Contact tracing says that if you've been exposed to a person positive for COVID-19, we have ways, technological ways and other ways, to trace you and notify you. That also raises questions about information and privacy, one of the issues that the Senate Judiciary Committee considers. The Bureau of Prisons. Currently now in the Bureau of Prisons, there's a raging conflict because there's raging infection. It's not the only correctional institution that faces that, but it does. The guards, correction officers, as well as the inmates themselves are at risk because COVID-19 is in the ranks of those serving time in our prisons. Many states and even the federal government, to some extent, are considering the appropriate policy to keep America safe, but also to treat these individuals with fairness, especially those who are working for the federal government, doing what we're asking them to do. That's in the jurisdiction of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Instead of this Kentucky nominee from Senator McConnell that he wants to move up quickly into the second highest court of the land, shouldn't we be asking basic questions about the policies of the Bureau of Prisons? Immigration issues, too. It's interesting when you take a look at the spokespersons when it comes to medicine. So many of them, not all of them by any means, so many of them are clearly new immigrants to America. I want to salute all of our healthcare heroes. We have signs in our yard at home, and others around the neighborhood do as well. We can't thank these men and women enough for coming to work every day and risking their lives. Doctors, nurses, lab technicians, those working in nursing homes, risking their lives every day to keep us safe, to treat those who are infected, to save the lives of people we love. And as you listen on television to their comments about the risks they're taking and the costs they're paying with their families and others, I note how many of them are clearly new immigrants to this country. Well, it's no surprise. Many of these people, well-trained and educated, come to the United States for opportunity they can't get in their home country. And we prosper in terms of our health care because of that decision. But when it comes to decisions by the United States Senate in dealing with immigration and health care, you would think that we have no use for these people. Take the DACA protectees, those who under President Obama's executive order have the protection of DACA so they will not be deported from the United States and they can legally work in the United States. These are important people. And I tried with Senator Graham on a bipartisan amendment back 6 weeks ago to say that their legal status in America would be respected at least until the end of this calendar year so they can continue to be here without fear of deportation, and it was stopped. And the comment, according to Senator Graham, from one of his colleagues was, there go Durbin and Graham again working on the DREAM Act. Well, yes, I am. I'm still working on the DREAM Act. And you know why I do in this instance? Because out of the 780,000 DACA protectees, at least 41,000 of them are in the healthcare field today. And when it comes to those here in temporary protected status in the United States, at least 11,000 of them. Are we ready to say publicly what some members of the Senate say privately? Let them leave. We don't need them. I'm not going to say that. I know better. And so do families across America who, thank goodness, for these healthcare heroes, those born in the United States, those not born in the United States, but coming here to help us through this public health care crisis. Immigration. It's an issue for the Senate Judiciary Committee. Will there be a hearing this week? None have been posted. It relates to this COVID-19 challenge, and we haven't even addressed it. What about profiteering? Wouldn't that be an interesting issue for us to have a hearing on in the Senate Judiciary Committee? Violations of current law. I spend my time, as I mentioned, in telephone conference with a lot of people who are buying protective equipment, administrators of hospitals and clinics, medical professionals themselves, and they report what's happened. It came from Fairfield, Illinois, which is a smaller community in downstate Illinois, where the hospital administrator said, "Senator, we used to pay 22 cents for a surgical gown, 22 cents for a surgical gown at this hospital. The price is now between $11 and $20 a piece." Somebody's ripping them off. They know it, and I know it, and the Senate Judiciary Committee should know it too. There's another issue we could take up, I hope we'll consider. But instead, we have Senator McConnell's nominee for the D.C. Court of Appeals, which he considers to be vital national business. I don't see it that way. What I see is a lot of people here gathered in the Capitol doing their jobs as they were hired to do and as they are dedicated to perform, at risk. I'm prepared to be here because that's what I ran for office to do, but I would hope it would be for something substantive to deal with real issues of national security and certainly issues related to this national health emergency. The District of Columbia and the states on either side of the district, Maryland and Virginia, all continue to record new cases of COVID infection and death. They have not seen the 2-week decline in new COVID cases that the White House guidelines announced a few weeks ago that are necessary to begin the first phase of reopening. The opposite's true. In this Washington metropolitan area where we have been called in to work today, we find a COVID hotspot. In the week ending last Thursday, the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia recorded a combined 20,000 new COVID cases, staggering amount of sickness and suffering. All 3 jurisdictions remain under stay-at-home orders to try to curb the spread of this deadly virus and save lives and ease the burden on our exhausted medical workers. My state of Illinois also remains under a stay-at-home order, as do more than half the states. Not one state in America has yet to meet the first requirement of safety, reopening our schools and businesses and communities in this pandemic. That first requirement, a 2-week decline in new infections. Like millions of Americans, members of the Senate and our staffs have been working from home for the last 6 weeks to try to save lives and keep our health system from collapsing. I do have to take exception to the statement made by Senator McConnell when he said across America, you don't get to take days off. I've been on the phone every single day, and my colleagues the same, talking to people in their own home states, dealing with challenges and issues facing businesses and labor unions and charities, hospitals. The list is so long I don't know where to start or where to end. But to suggest that I was home taking a day off, not in my home, Senator McConnell, my kitchen became my surrogate office, and I'm sure many senators will say the same. I worked as hard there as I do in this building, maybe harder on some days. So we didn't take days off. We've negotiated a nearly $500 billion COVID emergency aid package for our home states, a life support package to provide much needed resources for testing and for our heroic healthcare workers. When you take a look at the issue of lost revenue, I spoke to the mayor of the District of Columbia a few minutes ago, and she talked about revenue that's obviously lost to her, hundreds of millions of dollars, which she has to face in the next budget, all related to COVID, all related to the downturn in our economy. The same thing is true in my state and virtually every other state. This COVID crisis has taken its toll on business activity, on the attendance at events, at purchases, and it means less revenue coming into the coffers of states and local governments. We provided $150 billion for this purpose in the original CARES bill. Many of us believe we need to stand up for them again. You can't give speeches on the floor about your respect for the police and first responders and firefighters and then come up and say, and it's a darn shame that the people that employ them will not be able to pay them in the months ahead. And this notion of declaring bankruptcy, what an economic disaster that would be if states and local governments were declaring bankruptcy right and left, not to mention the real hardship it would cause among first responders and those healthcare workers, including nurses, that we value so much. So many of them, those that are employed by state and local government, would suffer if the suggestion of bankruptcy went forward. We can legislate without violating public health guidelines and risking making this pandemic worse. So the urgent business of the Senate should be the COVID-19 challenge that we face everywhere. Coming back to Washington, why isn't that a priority that's been announced? We don't know at this moment what will happen tomorrow or the 2 or 3 days after on the Senate agenda. If it related to COVID-19, count me in. If it relates to true national security, count me in. But if we're just coming here because of a promise made to a 38-year-old federal judge in Kentucky, it doesn't meet the test. This nominee, as I mentioned before, was judged unqualified. He's made statements openly hostile to the Affordable Care Act, and I'd like to address that for a moment. About 10 years ago, when we passed the Affordable Care Act, our goal was to reduce the number of Americans who had no health insurance. It was successful. It cut in half in the state of Illinois the number of uninsured, people without health insurance. Its critics didn't vote for it, haven't come up with an alternative to it, and like this Justin Walker, the federal judge in Kentucky, have been openly contemptuous of the notion of moving our nation toward full health care coverage. I don't think that argument is as compelling today, if it ever was, under the current circumstances. All of us appreciate the need for a real safety net. All of us understand that without real health insurance protection at this moment in history, people we love, our children, our spouses, our parents, would be at risk because they wouldn't have access to good quality health care. So this is a situation where this judicial nominee, Mr. Walker, found unqualified for the federal district court position, is now openly contemptuous of the Affordable Care Act and argues that it should be eliminated. At this moment in history, to eliminate the assurance of health care and health insurance protection, is that the person we want on the second highest court of the land? In the midst of the most deadly health crisis and the most devastating economic catastrophe of our times, the Majority Leader's agenda remains unchanged: to fill the federal bench at any cost. Mr. President, the Trump administration's response to the COVID-19 crisis has shocked many people. America has 5% of the world's population, yet we have 1/3 of the world's COVID infections and more than 25% of COVID deaths. Let me say that again. America with 5% of the world's population and more than 25% of the world's deaths. This morning, 67,682 Americans have died of this ferocious virus. They include my friends and people I know and members of my family. In my state of Illinois, we've lost 2,618 men, women, and children to this pandemic. When the Senate left Washington, D.C. 6 weeks ago to work from home, there were 5,000 COVID infections in my state. Today, more than 50,000. We're number 2 in testing, so our numbers, I think, are more accurate than many other states. Americans today feel great anxiety and sadness, but these healthcare professionals keep our heads up and our focus very clear. These essential heroes, doctors and nurses and respiratory therapists, pharmacists, men and women who make sure that there's food in these hospitals and the floors are clean. They include postal workers, grocery store clerks, truck drivers, law enforcement officers, teachers who continue to teach our kids and help to keep them safe. They're all part of this national effort. I would say that the notion of homeschooling, which is now, or e-schooling, which is now very common across America, has renewed the appreciation of many parents for what the teachers are doing every single day to help their kids. In my state and every state, people of color have suffered more than their share of COVID sickness and death, partly because of longstanding health inequities that leave people of color with more pre-existing health conditions, partly because of barriers to health care, and partly because black and brown people do so many of the jobs that are deemed essential. One major hospital in Chicago told me that half of the people who've died from COVID-19 in their hospital were uninsured, many of them Hispanic. They are people who may or may not have health insurance. They are desperate to work and earn a living. Some of them are afraid that either they or some member of their family may be deported if they even show up at a hospital and report themselves sick. And so they wait until it's literally too late and they die. We've seen our economy shut down and a lot of hardship as a result of it. Many owners of businesses, restaurants, and others have talked to me and others in the Senate about how soon we can reopen. But most of them, not all of them, but most of them understand that going through this kind of shutdown of our economy and our personal lives is bad if we do it one time. It's horrible to think about doing it a second time if we reopen too soon or in the wrong way. In my state, 830,000 people have filed for unemployment insurance between March 1st and April 25th. They are among the 30 million Americans who filed for unemployment since COVID came to America. 40 million. That is the fastest, deepest loss of jobs we have ever seen. To reopen our states and nations before we've done the hard and careful work required to reopen safely only risks more infection, more death, more lost jobs, and more economic hardship. Reopening before we can reopen safely risks overwhelming our hospitals and ICUs. We need to listen to the public health experts and the doctors and the nurses, many of whom have worked past exhaustion. We need to be responsible, not give in to the chants on the street. What is essential work the Senate should be doing? Investigating why we don't have enough testing in this country. It's essential to reopening the economy. Working with state and local and tribal governments to help them hire and train the estimated 300,000 contact tracers needed to reopen America safely. Rather than forcing states to bid against each other, we have to plead with the president to use his authority under the Defense Production Act to produce here in America the respirators and other PPE that's essential for workers and families. We ought to provide oversight of the Paycheck Protection Program and make sure that those loans are going to small business as we originally intended and not to wealthy hedge fund operators. We ought to be working on plans to shore up the U.S. Postal Service, an essential public service created under our Constitution. What a reminder it has been to all of us staying home, watching that letter carrier come by every single day. It's a bright spot, his big smile, greeted by everybody on my street with gratitude for his continuing work day in and day out. That's what our Postal Service is. And for them to be degraded and insulted by their critics is totally unfair, totally unfair. We ought to be making plans to ensure every American voter can vote by mail in the November election, given the likelihood that this lethal virus will still be threatening us. If this Senate is going to gather as a body in this pandemic, against medical advice of some and the sound judgment of others, let's make sure that our work is essential. We're still waiting for a report from the Republican Majority Leader about the agenda that brought us to Washington and brings us here this week, ready to work, ready to address the COVID-19 crisis that faces our country. Mr. President, I yield the floor, suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, clean and constant nuclear energy is one of the key pillars of America's energy security. Nuclear power plants supply 20% of our nation's electricity and more than 50% of our clean energy. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is the independent federal agency that regulates these power plants to protect public health and safety. It's a very important job. These independent regulatory structures, and this specific one, has successfully benefited the American people for decades by ensuring the safe operation of our nuclear reactors. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's Inspector General is responsible for detecting and preventing waste, fraud, and abuse, as well as mismanagement of the Commission. President Trump has nominated Mr. Robert Feitel to serve as Inspector General of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He did that last October. Mr. Feitel has been reported out of the Environment and Public Works Committee by unanimous vote in December. Today, the Senate will vote to confirm him. Mr. Feitel is well qualified. He brings a wealth of experience and expertise to this important position. Mr. Feitel has spent more than 25 years as an attorney at the Department of Justice and at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. During his long career, Mr. Feitel received numerous special achievement awards for his excellent service. Mr. Feitel will be the first new Inspector General at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in over 25 years. His nomination comes at a pivotal time for both the nuclear industry and the Commission. Some utilities are seeking to operate their nuclear plants for 20 more years, while others are shutting down, and they're shutting their reactors before their licenses even expire. The Commission is also preparing to license new nuclear technologies that will be essential to our clean energy future. This time of unprecedented activity requires a fully staffed and a fully functional agency. The Commission needs an Inspector General to promote efficiency and effectiveness of the Commission. Mr. Feitel is that individual. Mr. Feitel is a man of character whose commitment to upholding justice makes him an ideal candidate for the position. I encourage the entire Senate to vote today to confirm Mr. Robert Feitel to serve as the Inspector General of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, I'd ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, the Senate was gavelled out about 6 weeks ago now. We passed the $2.2 trillion CARES Act on March the 25th, and here it is May the 4th. Since that time, the global battle to defeat the coronavirus has only intensified. There have been some who've questioned the wisdom of the Senate coming back to Washington and convening, but I think we need to be here, and we need to do our jobs. We know how to do this safely. We know how to social distance. We know how to wash our hands, not touch our face. Those are the responsibilities each of us bear to one another, not to spread this virus. But if there is such a thing as essential and non-essential workers, and I don't think that distinction is one we should discuss, because 26 million Americans are not non-essential workers. They're absolutely essential to our economy and to our way of life. But make no mistake, self-government is essential under any construction, any definition of that word. Our system was not made to run on autopilot. So it's appropriate that we show up and we do our job and we protect the American people and do everything we can to defeat this virus from a public health standpoint, but also to do what is necessary to maintain a lifeline to the economy and the workers that are an essential component of it. And so when we defeat this virus, that we will be prepared for people to go back to work in full and keep our economy and jobs growing again. We know that about 3.5 million cases have been confirmed worldwide, and roughly a third of these cases are here in the United States. Tragically, we've lost 65,000 Americans to this cruel virus. But heroically, our healthcare workers have been on the job each and every day, like law enforcement and like grocery clerks, doing their part to help provide us the health care, the law enforcement, and the food that is feeding our families. We know for weeks on end our doctors and nurses and first responders have put themselves in harm's way to save the lives of those who have been affected by COVID-19. They are offering more than life-saving care. These men and women are a hand to hold, a friendly voice, and a source of comfort to patients isolated from friends and family because of this cruel disease. Our heroic healthcare workers are physically and mentally exhausted from this fight, but yet they continue to serve day in and day out. I want to express my gratitude, and I know I speak for others, when I say thank you for the heart that you've put into your job, for the sacrifices you've made, spending time away from your families so that you can help ours. Madam President, at the same time, we are seeing tremendous progress in a race to develop both treatments and a vaccine. And while there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic about how this story ends, I know a lot of work remains to be done. In addition to the physical toll this virus has taken on the American people, it has wreaked economic havoc. In order to slow the spread of the coronavirus, stores and restaurants have closed their doors, travel plans have been abandoned, events canceled, and millions of Americans were suddenly without a way to earn a living. In the past 6 weeks, 30 million Americans have filed for unemployment, an absolutely staggering figure. So far, Congress has passed 4 separate bills to address this crisis from a public health standpoint, as well as to ease its economic impact. We've provided billions of dollars in funding to support our hospitals, increase testing capacity, and ramp up the production and acquisition of the personal protective equipment our medical workers rely on, as well as the ventilators that many of the COVID-19 patients will need. We've provided unprecedented assistance for America's small businesses, which employ about half of America's workers. The Paycheck Protection Program has enabled small businesses to keep their employees on the payroll and cover expenses until the smoke clears. We've also sent vital funding to our state and local governments, about $150 billion. We've provided relief to student loan borrowers and sent financial assistance to the American people in the form of direct payments from the IRS. Members of Congress came together to act quickly and decisively to address this pandemic, and I'm very proud of the work that we have done together so far. Over the past several weeks, like every senator, I've had the privilege of speaking with my constituents all across the state of Texas about the impact of this virus, as well as Congress's response. I've spoken to doctors, nurses, hospital administrators about the strain on the personnel and the need for personal protective equipment. I've talked to small business owners across the state about their growing list of expenses and the lifeline that the PPP provided. I've listened to our mayors and county judges from our biggest cities and smallest towns who talked about the mounting financial burdens they are facing. I've talked with our farmers and ranchers about the impact on everything from cattle to cotton and the need to protect our food supply chain. I'm grateful for the men and women I've spoken with who've shared their perspective and feedback about Congress's response to the coronavirus. Now, anytime a piece of legislation moves this quickly, as these bills did, and are this big, there are bound to be gaps that need to be filled, mistakes that need to be corrected, tweaks that need to be applied. The Texans I've talked to over these past several weeks have pointed out some of those gaps and provided ideas for the discussions that we are having now about what comes next. A few weeks ago, I spoke with the representatives from the Texas Council on Family Violence and the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, and more than a dozen organizations across the state that support survivors of domestic violence. When you think about the impact of a pandemic, or any other major crisis for that matter, domestic violence isn't typically one of the first issues that comes to mind. But the circumstances we are facing today make these cases all too common. People are spending more time isolated at home. They're dealing with a new range of stresses brought on by this virus, more time with their partner, financial struggles, teaching their children at home, and it's taking a devastating toll. When Texas's stay-at-home order was first announced, many organizations saw a spike in their hotline calls. But what's more frightening, once these orders were in place, the number of calls took a sharp decline. In Tarrant County, which is where Fort Worth is located, call numbers dropped by almost half. With so much time isolated at home with an abuser, it may be more difficult to reach out to friends or family or contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline for assistance. Deciding whether or not to leave, to go to a shelter, there's also the risk of the virus itself, and many are faced with a lose-lose scenario. Do you continue living under the same roof as your abuser, or do you go to a shelter where you or your children may come in contact with the virus? These are not the only silent victims of this crisis. The fear and anxiety brought on by this pandemic has taken a toll on America's mental health. Most of us have never gone through something like this. Maybe none of us have gone through something quite like this. Our daily routines have been turned on their head, isolated from friends and family, and between social media and a 24-hour news cycle, it can be difficult to find a way to escape the constant barrage of bad news and anxiety. Compounding the problem even further is the financial strain on many of the providers who support these individuals. A recent survey of providers by the National Council for Behavioral Health showed that more than 60% of mental health providers have already been forced to close one or more programs, 60%. And 62% of providers cannot survive more than 3 months without emergency financial assistance. As we continue working to help the American people through this difficult time, we cannot forget those who are suffering in silence. Madam President, we have a big job ahead of us. That's why it's so important that we are here doing our job on behalf of the 330 million people in this country. I've returned back to the Senate with a long list of ideas and feedback from the Texans who've been generous enough to spend time talking with me over the past few weeks. I know all 100 members of the Senate are in a similar position, and I hope we can retain the same sense of bipartisanship that has guided us through the legislation we've passed so far. If we're going to win this fight, and we will, it won't be because of a Republican idea or a Democrat one. It will be because every single person in this chamber checked their political priorities at the door and responded together, united, to confront and defeat this virus and to help restore our economy and the jobs that go along with it. We've done it before. Let's do it again. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I have a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
good idea. Do you need her? Oh, yeah, it's just Cassie. Right, right. Of course, if you copy them both, she's got a phone at home, so Alice will get it too. If you. Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, yeah. I know. You know what I was just thinking? I'm hungry too. This is a great time to lose weight. Right. This is one of the problems. Hello. Hey, that's all right. Oh.
Mr. President.
The senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak on behalf of the nomination of
The Senate's in a quorum call.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak on behalf of the nomination of Robert Vitale to serve as Inspector General of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which oversees the safety and security of almost 100 nuclear power plants throughout this country. An important job. But this is a nomination I urge the majority to take up and pass, not this week, not this month, but before we went into recess on April the 8th. But we're here, and this is a good nomination. I hope my colleagues will support it. Having said that, let me remind my colleagues that we're still in the middle of a global pandemic. If we need to be reminded, I don't think we do. But once we voted on the nomination before us today, I would urge the Senate to pivot and begin focusing next on examining issues related to the pandemic and to ensuring that the assistance we provided in the legislation we passed so far, four pieces, some bigger than others, is getting to the families and the communities that badly need it. If we are unable or unwilling to do so, I'm not sure that the Senate should be returning to Washington to act on non-urgent business in contravention of the recommendation of the Office of the Attending Physician, and while this entire region is still under stay-at-home orders. I also want to make it clear that the Environment and Public Works Committee, in which I serve and lead with the Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming, was willing to approve this particular nomination unanimously by voice vote. But it is what it is, and we're here today. In the midst of a global pandemic, Mr. President, the Majority Leader says he's concerned with nominations. And well, then let's address positions that are actually more relevant to the crisis that we face today. Currently, 1/3 of the Inspector General and Inspector General's positions are confirmed by the Senate, either remain vacant or without permanent leadership. The President has nominated individuals to fill some, but not all of these positions. The Senate should work quickly to vet those nominees we have received, especially those who would be involved with oversight of the coronavirus response. My colleagues will require that this past March, Mr. President, Congress passed an unprecedented $2 trillion relief package, the CARES Act, to bring help to millions of Americans who find themselves in dire straits through no fault of their own. Thankfully, the CARES Act created 3 new separate oversight bodies to monitor this emergency funding. I was also proud to work with Democrats and Republican colleagues alike, Mr. President, to help secure an additional $20 million to ensure that the Government Accountability Office, affectionately known as GAO, can conduct important oversight of this funding. In fact, I learned last week that GAO has already notified Congress that it has already either undertaken or begun investigations or has planned investigations to 150 audits that are related to this funding. And I appreciate GAO's diligence on this important matter. Not just I appreciate it, we appreciate it, and American taxpayers appreciate it as well. More than ever, it's critical that we have robust oversight to make sure that this money gets into the pockets of those who need it most and not into the pockets of those who would literally steal money from the needy and steal money from the taxpayers of this country. If our Majority Leader wants to bring the Senate back, then if I could, I'd like to suggest that our time would be well spent making sure that those oversight bodies created in the CARES Act are fully functional, including the CARES Act Congressional Oversight Commission, which I'm told still lacks a chairperson. This is a 5-person panel, one created by each of our leaders in the House and the Senate. And that would be 4. That would give us 4. And then another one would be jointly agreed to by the Majority Leader here and the Speaker of the House. I'm told that as of today, as of this moment, we still lack a chairperson of that important panel. And I hope that our leader here, Leader McConnell and Speaker Pelosi, will work with haste even today, to jointly name a chair to the Congressional Oversight Commission as required by law. The CARES Act also created the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. That's a committee composed of inspectors general from relevant agencies to oversee all spending appropriated through the CARES Act. That's a huge undertaking. Unfortunately, those IG positions at key agencies, including the Treasury Department and including the Department of Education, still remain vacant. And we've seen over the last month just how crucial it is that our IGs remain independent. Since the Senate was last in session, the President has unceremoniously removed, reassigned, or undermined highly regarded inspectors general who apparently weren't loyal enough to him or who dared to criticize what they viewed as a failed or flawed response to the coronavirus. For example, at the beginning of April, President Trump removed Glenn Fine, highly regarded acting inspector general for the Pentagon, who had only a week earlier been selected by his peers to chair the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, the third oversight body created by the CARES Act. We've also seen the President look to replace the Health and Human Services IG, who in a detailed report pointed out the severe shortages that a number of our hospitals have been facing during the coronavirus outbreak. I believe it's clear that Congress needs to speak up when appropriate and do a better job supporting our inspectors general. When this president, or frankly any president, takes retaliatory actions against the independent watchdogs responsible for identifying failures, waste, fraud, and abuse across our federal government, especially when this much money is at risk. If the Senate is going to be back in session, it would seem to me that these critical oversight positions should be among our top priorities. Having said that, let me turn again to the nomination before the Senate today. Like all agencies, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission needs a strong and independent inspector general. And I believe in Mr. Feitel, we have one. I believe he's up to the task. We cannot be complacent when it comes to nuclear safety. Just remember, 50% of the carbon-free energy produced in this country is produced by our nuclear power plants. Think about that. In a day and age when the climate crisis is a huge threat to literally to our planet and to those of us who live on it, right now, half of the carbon-free electricity comes in this country from nuclear power plants. And it's the job of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to oversee those plants and make sure that they're being run well, run safely, and in ways that enable us to continue to depend on them as we go forward for carbon-free electricity. But anyway, Mr. Feitel is well qualified and prepared. I think, certainly our committee, the Environment and Public Works Committee, believes prepared to take on this responsibility. And I hope my colleagues will join Senator Barrasso, our chairman, and myself and the members of our committee to vote yes on this nomination. And with that, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, I don't see anybody waiting to speak after me, so I'll just note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Mr. President,
The senator from Indiana.
we in a quorum call.
Yes,
Can we lift the quorum call?
without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, I rise today to honor and recognize the life and contributions of Mr. Jim Cummings to the countless Hoosiers whose lives he's touched over the 9 decades. Jim was a giant in Indiana. His long and rich life left many indelible marks on our state. We look to people like Jim Cummings as an example of a life well lived through service to others. His role in founding the Indiana Black Expo in 1970 made him a leader to all Hoosiers during a time of great change in our state and our nation. As a lifelong servant to those in his state and community, his dedication to conservative principles guided his thoughts and actions for many years. His life of service extended beyond his work with the Indiana Black Expo. It included serving his community in public office, on a number of boards in Indianapolis, and working as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Department of Housing and Urban Development under President Ronald Reagan. Indiana has lost one of its most distinguished Hoosiers of this generation. The Cummings family has lost a father, a grandfather, and a great-grandfather. I join them in mourning the loss of Jim Cummings. Mr. President, in closing, I want to personally thank the Cummings family for the vast contributions he made to Indianapolis and the Hoosier State. Both are better because of him. On behalf of me and my wife, Maureen, we extend our sincere condolences to all his family and friends at this time. In my remaining time, I want to recommend the confirmation of Robert Vitale to be Inspector General of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We reviewed his nomination in my subcommittee in December of last year. I believe he is fully qualified for this position. During subcommittee consideration, we received a letter of support from the Chief of the Department of Justice's Capital Case Section, who noted that Mr. Vitale has exhibited the ability to provide a fair-minded, independent assessment of each case, to scrupulously adhere to his ethical obligations, and to follow the facts and evidence wherever they lead. These characteristics are necessary for any Inspector General, but particularly at the NRC. Mr. President, I would like to close by noting that Mr. Vitale's confirmation today is an example of why the Senate should be getting back to work. Essential American workers are getting up every morning to stock our grocery stores, deliver the mail, and transport critical supplies to our healthcare workers. It is our responsibility to ensure that they have the resources to do their jobs, and the assurances of our nation's government is working in their best interests. Mr. President, it seems to me that the Inspector General of the NRC is a position that you could label as essential. Even though America's nuclear plants are operating at historically high levels of safety and performance, we can never be too careful. We cannot let our guard down. It is irresponsible to let this agency go so long without a confirmed independent regulator. Had the Senate not returned today, this office would go another day with the lights not on. I am proud that the Senate is returning to ensure that Mr. Vitale can assume his post quickly, and that this Senate can continue working to serve the best interests of the American people. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the question occurs on the nominee.
Yeas and nays?
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman.
Yes.
Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran.
I'm going to take that from you, John.
Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts.
Aye.
How's everybody doing? Just hanging in there? Excellent. Just right here.
Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Blackburn, Bozeman, Braun, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Cassidy, Collins, Duckworth, Gardner, Hirono, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kane, Kennedy, Perdue, Reed, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Tester, Tillis, Wyden. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Ms. McSally, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mrs. Leffler, aye. Ms. Harris, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley. Aye. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones. Aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi. Aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley. Aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. Aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass. Aye. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. Aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker. Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. Aye.
Senators recognized.
Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Daines, aye.
The nays are 0. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 111.
Question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. Clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, William R. Evanina of Pennsylvania to be Director.
I send the cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of William R. Evanina of Pennsylvania to be Director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, signed by 17 senators, as
I ask
follows.
consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask consent the mandatory quorum call be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to legislative session for a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent appointments at the desk appear separately in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 11 a.m. Tuesday, May the 5th. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired. The journal of proceedings be approved to date. The time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day. Further, following leader remarks, the Senate proceed to executive session and resume consideration of the Evanina nomination. Finally, I ask that the Senate recess from 12:30 to 2:15 to allow for the weekly conference meetings.
Without objection.
So there's no further business to come before the Senate. I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 11 a.m. tomorrow.